Welcome to Liberty Unlocked. I'm Don Watkins. All right, I am super excited for this episode. This is one of my favorite conversations ever because it's one of my favorite people to talk to ever. My friend Daniel Richards, who's an expert in digital media and social media and has really helped a lot of people and organizations build huge followings. And a lot of what we're going to talk about is really kind of, I focused on advice that he would offer free market pro-liberty organizations, but as you'll see, it's really applicable to all of us. A lot about the kind of methods that we can go through in order to learn more about our audience and how to reach and expand our audience. And then just a bunch of broader lessons about, Daniel's background is in rhetoric. And so just a lot of discussion about how to talk about ideas in effective ways. So I'm really excited. I don't want to keep you from the interview any longer, but a few final thoughts. Remember that the best way to stay in touch and make sure you don't miss anything that we're working on is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. You can also support the show by going to libertyunlocked.com, where every dollar is used to improve the show and expand its reach. And with that, we can get on to the conversation with Daniel Richards. Well, cool. Thanks for coming on, Daniel. So we met, I don't remember what year it was. Maybe you do, at the Ayn Rand Institute. But I don't even know in detail sort of your story of what led you to working there. Now, you did digital media and social media for us back then, and that's sort of been the trajectory of your career. But how did you get interested in ideas in the first place? And then I'm curious as to how because you were, one of the early people in the social media universe before every college kid, I'm a digital media expert. So, but where did the whole journey start for you?
It was back when we used to call it new media. But yes, so I started getting interested in ideas around the age of 3 or so, I'd say. I don't know. I started reading. I always wanted to be an adult, is actually how that story starts.
I totally relate to that. Totally.
I identified from a very young age that being a kid was not great, actually, and that adults got to do everything that was wonderful. And so I wanted to be an adult. So when I could read, I started reading adult things like newspapers, back when those were printed. But I always wanted to be an adult. So I had an early interest in ideas, and I was a conservative only because I think those were the columns I was reading at the time.
What paper were you getting?
The Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
Which was pretty good. Not a bad education for a young person, honestly. And I took that interest in ideas through school. I was always arguing with teachers. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know the principles behind things. I didn't want to just be told information. I wanted to be able to get to the root cause of everything. I was that kind of kid. And so come high school-ish, I started to have a much deeper dive into, I guess, first principles types things, which came through religion for me. I started questioning being religious. I would go to church every week, but I didn't really get it. Everyone kept talking about how the spirit of Jesus flowed through them and they could feel it. And I just kept looking around saying, I don't feel it. And actually, it was my pastor who set me down the course of being interested in Ayn Rand. And he gave this fascinating sermon one day about how God doesn't actually want your blind obedience. God wants you to understand him through reason. And if you can't understand him through reason, then you shouldn't be a believer. And I don't know why he gave that sermon.
Typical Sunday sermon.
I have no idea to this day. I never asked him about it. I just remember it vividly. And that was the day I thought, well, I actually don't understand him through reason, so I'm going to move on with that part of my life, although I still enjoyed the community of church for a long time. But I started then getting into rhetoric as a means of understanding the world, partially because once I thought there's no God, I thought there was no truth. And so I thought everything was only what you could convince other people of. And so I became obsessed with persuasion and this concept of that anyone who can master changing someone's mind actually masters the world.
Who would you have been reading in those days? I mean, rhetoric is obviously a throwback word. It's a lovely word. I like it actually in many ways better than persuasion. because it's more focused on what you're doing rather than the pretense that you can do something to someone else.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
much more about you're offering something that then they can take and run with. Uh, and it's just a more beautiful word. But I'm curious as to, what was your entry point there, or some of the things that you were imbibing that were influential?
I was lucky enough to have teachers who would assign classical essays in addition to reading the nonsense modernist literature in high school. So we would read The Perks of Being a Wallflower, but then we would also read an essay by Plato. And via Socrates, Plato would talk about things like the sophists of the time being engaged in empty rhetoric and going around and just persuading everyone for a buck, and how horrible that was. And that led me to Aristotle, and Aristotle's rhetoric, although it is a tough one to make your way through, was life-changing for me in the sense that he was the first person, I think, who laid out the principles of rhetoric. And since I was such a principle-focused person, it made much more sense to me as an approach. And then from there, I just dove into all the classical rhetorical treatises, Cicero, Quintilian, and the rest. So
One of the best gifts I ever got. This was many years ago when Alex Epstein and I both worked at the Ayn Rand Institute, and I wanted to. I was horrible at speaking, and wanted to get good. And he got me Cicero's book on rhetoric, which I think is not a real book, but a collection of different pieces that he either wrote or gave in his time, and that was very treasured.
what a master! Absolutely, Cicero is, and Alex, but Cicero. So I come to college. I don't really know what I believe per se philosophically, because I had been wrestling with this idea of there not being truth. I was exposed to a lot of leftist philosophy, John Rawls, and that didn't make any sense to me. And I was in a contemporary philosophy class, like you do, and we got to the very last lesson, and it was an essay. I forget the philosopher, and it's probably better that I've forgotten the philosopher, but his essential thesis was, since there's no meaning to life, you should kill yourself. And
That's what we call in philosophy biting the bullet, literally.
And so my professor was awesome. He was open to questions and open to pushback, and he encouraged critical thinking. And on the last sort of day of discussion of this class and this essay, I asked him, do any modern philosophers care to live? Or something. I don't remember, that's not verbatim, but it was something to that effect. And he sort of laughed and he said, well, this is how I phrased it. Some people get something out of Ayn Rand. That's what he said. There you go. And that was during the days of libraries. And I walked to the library, and it took me a while in the literal card catalog to find Ayn Rand, because it wasn't a typical spelling of Anne, as I found out, nor was it Anne, in fact. But I checked out Atlas Shrugged, went home for that summer. That was the summer after my sophomore year, read Atlas Shrugged twice that summer, and did not have the epiphany that many people have where they think, oh, this is right. This is everything I believed. My thought was, this is so clear and so, I'll use the word simple, but maybe it's just clear is the right word, that it must be wrong. Because I had this exposure to philosophy where everything was overly complex, and you had to sit down and with a dictionary to decipher every single word and what they were trying to say, and it was almost a mystery as to what they were actually getting at. And her writing was so amazingly precise and clear that I thought, nope, this can't be it. It makes too much sense. It's too reasonable. It just can't be right. And so, as a philosophy major and then later an English major, I undertook a bunch of independent studies with philosophy professors, basically studying objectivism over the course of the next 2 years and then into graduate school, with the intention initially of being the one who proved Ayn Rand wrong. And
Fair enough.
Quite the opposite happened. Come graduate school at Clemson University, that was the first year that I said that I am an objectivist. And decided that I was going to stop trying to prove Ayn Rand wrong, and I wanted to start promoting the ideas of objectivism. So
I like that you had a period where, because I was more on the other side of like rush to agreement. Granted, I discovered it when I was 15, so I was going to rush to something dumb. But and what happened was, once I got into my 20s, I had to go back and really do the hard work of, do I really understand this? Like, what are the best objections? How can I push against this in order to really have a firsthand understanding? And I think you save yourself a lot of headaches by, in effect, starting from the premise of like, let's ferret out all the mistakes, because I have nothing invested in this being right. If anything, I have something invested in overturning it. So that once you reach a stage of being convinced, you've genuinely been convinced.
It was definitely a different approach, and I didn't have a community of other objectivists in undergrad. It was just me, and it was just reading things, and it was just professors who, for the most part, were fine that I was questioning this material, but were even a little bit annoyed that I was reading it in the first place. Which was fine with me, because that made me happy, because I was an antagonist to my professors all throughout college. But then in graduate school, I got to meet Dr. Brad Thompson and Dr. Eric Daniels, and sit through and read Atlas Shrugged chapter by chapter and really dive into it. And that's sort of what solidified my not only my understanding of it, I believe, but also my wanting to advocate for objectivism. But the slow-moving train of my life was still pushing me toward this much more academic career in rhetoric. I thought I was going to be a rhetoric professor. After graduate school, I got accepted into a PhD program at Rensselaer Polytechnic in rhetoric, and got there, and in 6 months, that train came to a halt, and I thought, I can't do this. I just can't do this. I can't debate one more time the rhetoric of nothingness, or if there's meaning to syntax, or if grammar is all there is in the universe. I couldn't do it anymore. And totally, serendipitously, that is when the Ayn Rand Center, the version in Washington, D.C., put out a job post for their first ever new media director. I forget exactly, coordinator or something like that. And I decided I was going to give everything I had to get this position and leave graduate school. And so I trained down from upstate New York to meet some folks at the Ayn Rand Center, and that was 2009, October 2009. So we must have met probably sometime later that year when I first came out to California. And there's the year for you. So
then let's back up to, 2009. Like, what was even going on in the social media at that place? I mean, Facebook now had a real foothold. I think MySpace was either dead or it was on its last legs by that point. Twitter, I think, had just launched, but nobody knew about it, roughly in that period.
2007. But yeah, it was just starting to get attention.
Yeah, I don't think Ashton Kutcher had hit 1 million yet, which was like a big breakthrough point. So, like, how did you get interested in that world? I mean, obviously, college would have been where this was really a live issue, but paint that picture a little bit.
So I was in undergrad still with the interest in rhetoric. I was also the newspaper editor, and Facebook had just come to our campus. This must have been 2006-ish, 2005-ish. That time, they didn't have pages back then. It was just your profile and your wall, and you could write on people's walls. But I immediately saw that our newspaper should have a profile. So I set up what was then very much against their terms of service, a profile for this non-living person, and started talking to people as this newspaper instead of as me. And that got a lot of attention on campus and a lot of interest in the newspaper. And it was immediately apparent to me that this was going to totally change how, at that time, I didn't say brands. I would have said something like companies or businesses talk to their customers. That was shut down by Facebook because it was absolutely violating their terms of service. But eventually they opened up this thing for pages, and that became a big deal. But in graduate school then, when things were taking off in the social media world and I was still studying rhetoric and mass communication, it just became abundantly clear to me that we were not going back to some other model, and that I needed to figure out how the principles of rhetoric pertain in this mass media environment where where there's no more gatekeepers, basically.
I mean,
And
I just want to stress for people because this can seem like duh now, but that is not how people were thinking. Like I'm a little bit older than you, and like I remember that period, and particularly if you're talking about organizations, brands, the idea was that like this is kind of what the kids do, and hey, I'm going to this party, and later with Twitter, hey, look at my plate of food. But almost nobody at that time thought this is going to be the mode of communicating serious ideas or business ideas. Like that was really something that was going against the grain at that point. Did you have a sense of that, or was it just you just thought this was obviously going to be the way that people were going to interact?
I think I only had a sense of it once I started working, once I started doing professional digital and saw that there was pushback on that concept. As much as I love and adore Yaron Brook, and everyone should check out Yaron's show, I remember famously a conversation where he said, "You can't tweet philosophy." And I thought, okay, but you kind of can. You can't tweet a treatise in the same traditional way, but every mode of communication we get changes how we communicate. It doesn't mean that we just can't communicate philosophy anymore through these media. It means we have to figure out how to communicate philosophy through these media. But so 2009 specifically was sort of a breakout year for YouTube. And 2010 then was an even bigger breakout year for YouTube. And it became clear that the direction things were going was user-created, user-generated content, peer-to-peer stuff that wasn't just text and tweets. It was more of a multimedia rich environment. And so that's sort of the direction I wanted to take things for the Ayn Rand Institute. And that was the year that we did the Atlas Shrugged video contest, asking people to create their own 3 to 5 minute videos, either explaining a concept for Atlas Shrugged or explaining why Atlas Shrugged was important to them. And at that time, that was not radical, but it was certainly uncommon, an approach to things. I think we received something about 120 entries from people that in totality gained millions-ish of views, and including a segment on John Stossel's brand new show at that point on Fox Business, where he announced the winners. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that, and that was, I mean, it was really successful for anything we had done. But I think what happened, and businesses continue to do this. It didn't have sort of like standard measurable results. Like we got this views, like this, these views, what next? And so we didn't double down on it and didn't see the value of just build that engagement, keep people excited. And we don't know exactly how it's going to pay off, but we know like we're in the mix. And so it was one of those things where I feel like we got in the ground relatively early and we're doing things that were working, and it never got elevated to a priority. And I don't say this as a judgment, because I held the same view of like, that's nice, but what does it amount to? Like,
exactly.
Whose minds are we changing? How is this influencing the debate? And now a decade later, now I've come back to the view of like, that really is a key game to be playing, of be where people are already giving their attention, build that kind of engagement, excitement. And look, you get things like Stossel, you get people pouring their creativity into it. And if they're getting a payoff of, hey, I did this Ayn Rand thing, and now who's just like some kid, in their college dorm room, I got 50,000 views. Well, maybe that's something you can nurture in your direction. And so I think it was a real illustration of that your thesis was correct, and a real illustration of most people didn't see it. And I think even now continue not to really fully buy in, at least those of us who are, well, I'm not quite 40, but like that era, that there is this, that's an important form of engagement, right? And that you have to think about it very differently than you would like, oh, I got 20,000 book sales or something.
Yeah, I don't harbor any ill will from that era in the sense that very few people saw it, and I had this thesis, but I wasn't gonna bet everything on this thesis because it was also so brand new. And while I thought it was successful, it was hard to determine what success looked like. You're exactly right. What does a view mean on YouTube? I mean, back then you didn't even have the crazy in-depth metrics that they have now. We didn't know how long someone watched something, so a view could have been a blip. How do we know that they're not gaming the system for vanity's sake? But yeah, I think we're at a point now where it's funny where the digital world we've gone as broad as we can, or maybe not, but we've gone fairly broad in terms of reach in digital, and now we're moving back to narrow. Now we're moving back to niche. Now we're getting back to finding sub-communities and owning your audience and using digital as a way to provide value, but then to bring someone back somewhere that you, as a content creator, own, a website or an email list or something like that. And that was always there, but certainly when we first started this whole digital adventure, it was, oh, we're going to leave that behind because now we can infinitely reach millions of people with a Facebook page. And then suddenly Facebook and others decided they were going to change the game a little bit. So not only pay to play, but now can't even pay to play if you have certain viewpoints or if you're controversial or.
Yeah, and we had a conversation about this a month or so ago that I ended up writing something about like just this problem of that, particularly if you're in the business of selling controversial ideas, you're in a very risky, precarious spot if you're depending on any social media platform. And, so you want to think about ways to own your audience. You want to think about diversification. I think ultimately, some people are out there trying to create free speech platforms. But part of what I argued there is if all you're doing is duplicating what already exists, but like promising that you're not going to screw people over, you're not going to be able to attract enough people because there's so much that goes into those working, above all network effects, which is you don't have a lot of people. They already have a lot of people. So why am I going to go to your platform? What, just in case they'll cancel me over there? It's not a really compelling ask. So, I mean, what is your take on kind of the state of the liberty movement? And we can take away, you work at an organization in the liberty movement now. I work with clients there. So abstracting away from ones that we're personally invested with, what do you think of the state of what liberty organizations are doing in the new media, digital media space, social media space today? And, where would you like to see us go? Or what are some of the challenges that we face in getting to a better place?
So I will say that from when I started in the liberty space, generally speaking, liberty organizations have gotten much better at communicating ideas. They've adopted many more technologies, but a lot of it has been fairly recent, I would say, at least in terms of adoption and full utilization. And so, to be specific, video, for instance,
video is the big one I've seen progress on.
Is so much progress has been made. And very quickly, because I think, again, the liberty movement was probably 5-6-ish years behind in doing that. But generally speaking, I think liberty organizations are much more willing to experiment now, at least some of the better ones, if we're judging by who I think is doing it well, as opposed to what typically happens, especially in a nonprofit space, is even if an organization does something that's out of the box or interesting or, dare I say, effective, then they just have to keep doing that thing because now fundraising is dependent on it, and you don't want to change doing that thing because you might lose money. I think as the digital space just becomes more ingrained in our culture, donors are becoming more savvy about that now and are expecting a little more experimentation. I'm not going to say it's there yet or it's where it needs to be, but it's certainly getting better. So, Yeah, where would I like us? Where would I like the liberty movement to be? Well, I'd like us to be more experimental. I'd like us to try to not be as dependent on legacy platforms, for instance, and in fact to, as you were talking about earlier, diversify. I like to think about it as platform agnosticism. How do you create a content strategy, for instance, that isn't dependent on any particular platform, that only uses them to the extent that they create value for their users, then that you take advantage of that, but that ultimately everything you're producing you own, you have a home for, you are trying to drive people to, etc. I think people are. Sorry,
I
go ahead.
agree with that. I do, though. Alarm bells going off in my brain, because one of the biggest mistakes, particularly brands or organizations make, is that their platform agnosticism consists of going on to every platform and saying, go look at our stuff, go look at our stuff, go look at our stuff, go look at our stuff.
That's a very good point.
And
Yes.
that does not work. Like that is like if all you're doing is an alarm bell to say, hey, go do this other thing, rather than creating content that's contextually valuable on that platform, I don't think you achieve anything good.
That is an excellent clarification. And what I mean by platform agnosticism is don't come out and say, our strategy for the next 3 years is going to be to build as big a Twitter following as we can. Just focus on Twitter, 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 et cetera, et cetera. That's not great, especially if Twitter decides, hey, you're too controversial for us now, and we're going to pull your reach. No good. Yeah, certainly what I mean is don't be reliant on any one platform, but insofar as you are going to be on a platform, you better take advantage of that platform's unique value proposition and create as best you can, or not create, modify your content, create value in that platform as its users expect to receive value, but don't be reliant on it.
Yeah, I mean, this is one big lesson I want to underscore for everybody. This isn't just for organizations, but and maybe I've told this story before, but one of the most awful experiences I ever had was when my book Equals is Unfair came out. I got to do a Reddit Ask Me Anything, but I had literally never spent any time on Reddit. So I knew nothing about like, what are people looking for there? What are their expectations? And so, well, I have a book coming out. So, people would ask a question, be like, oh, well, we answer this in the book. And like, and within, 5 or 10 questions, the outpouring of disgust at this guy promoting his book, which is like a big sin. And if you spend any time in Reddit, you would know, like, no. You're here to answer our questions, and that's fine. You can let us know you have a book, but you cannot
Right.
be promoting. It was like within 20 minutes, just a bombardment of insults and anger. And I had committed to doing like 2 hours of this. And I think I just quit after an hour. But that was a big lesson for me of like, really take seriously, you're entering, if not somebody's home, you're entering a little clubhouse. What are the club rules? What are the club expectations? And you can bend those if you can think of a creative way to use it that's even more valuable, but do that at your peril, because people are in a certain headspace when they're using it. And if you're just like, what you don't want to do is you get to the club and you have a whole bunch of like, rappers saying, hey man, buy my CD, buy my, like, that's, don't be that guy.
Yeah, it's certainly a couple things there. That's a great story to illustrate the point. I think that too many times there are two types of failures. One is spreading oneself too thin. Either it's individual or an organization without the resources who say, well, we have to be on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Parlay now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No, you don't. How about you create meaningful, valuable content and then choose one, for instance, where you think you can learn to be a value on that platform, learn to speak that platform's language, be involved with a particular audience, and first of all, are the people you want to reach on that platform, for instance.
Right.
And just choose one, get good at it, and then scale. You don't have to do everything simultaneously, especially you could be doing damage if you're doing that and you're not doing it well. And the second thing is, in thinking about, again, going back to my undergraduate years with putting the newspaper on Facebook, I immediately thought of it like, well, what if you were meeting our newspaper at a party? You pick rappers, but I picked a newspaper because I'm nerdy. What if you were meeting this newspaper at a party, and all we kept saying is, have you seen this latest article? Click here to read whatever. Have you seen my latest work? Have you seen my latest work? You'd be the worst person at the party.
Right.
People would hate you. So if you're a brand, and whether that's you as a person or whether it's your organization, we're at a party on social media, would people be annoyed by you? Would they find you fascinating? Would they want to talk to you? Would they want to continue conversation later, go out on a date or whatever it is, however you want to think about the weird metaphor as it goes down the line? But be interesting. You point this out a lot, which is simply sometimes the best you can do is be engaging and make people want to listen to what you have to say. So yeah, those two things. Don't overextend yourself, and also don't be that annoying guy at the party.
What about the whole issue of audience building? So one is, I think, like a fundamental is know the platforms that you're engaging with and provide value on those platforms. Do you have any thoughts on sort of opportunities in that area? Because as we've talked about separately, like the number one complaint, like organizations will pour a lot of man hours, a lot of money, and even these well done videos often that you see them doing, at least well done from a technical point of view. Maybe there's certain problems with, is this even the right topic to be doing a video on?
Right.
And they'll spend 10 grand, 20 grand and get 100 views, 1,000 views. And there's always the question of, if those are the right 1,000 views, maybe that's amazing, right? Like if what you're looking for is your next crop of interns, maybe you just need the right 1,000 people. But what's your take on audience building and sort of the things that we could be doing and the things that we often do that sabotage us?
Certainly. So one mantra that I have when talking to people about audience building is smaller. Go smaller. And partially what I mean by that is we're only convincing individuals. We're not convincing groups. And so who are the individuals you want to speak to? And sometimes you can literally identify that. So sometimes it's law students, for instance. Now that is a group, but it's a fairly small group. There's at any time about 130,000 law students in law school. And when you start thinking about, well, where are they located? At least in pre-COVID times. They're located at law schools, which have a physical location. They typically have .edu email addresses. They're searching for things in law and public policy. And partially what I mean by go smaller is also go where these people are having conversations already. So one of the things that is interesting about Twitter is you have hashtags and you have all of these various conversations going on that can be highly niche, but highly relevant to your audiences. If we're continuing down the law student example here, no one would ever think, but something like hashtag appellate Twitter is where meaningful, important conversation is going on about some of the nerdiest but most important legal topics. And if you can become a member of this community and be able to speak with them and not just advertise to them, then you're going to have a small but fairly dedicated audience, for instance, to help spread the word about your content and tell other people who aren't using that but who are in their sphere about you and about your content, etc. So that's, I think, how you start to do it from a sort of grassroots, no budget type level, is really find the places where the smallest group of people you can identify are having meaningful conversations. And that can take a lot of work. It can take years. Another example of this, back from when I worked on this documentary Frack Nation, which was a documentary sort of countering an anti-hydraulic fracturing or natural gas drilling method. We did a Kickstarter campaign to raise money for it. And one of the things was we were thinking about, well, who has money who would be interested in a pro drilling or natural gas exploration documentary? Oh boy. Obviously, oil and gas CEOs, but there's a really, as much as we would like to take their money and as much as we thought it was perfectly moral to take their money, there's a certain element of persuasion there that's not great, which is,
Yeah.
oh, now
It's
this is
not the
funded
ideal
by,
optics, right?
right. So we thought, well, okay, not that. But when we started doing digging and who was having these meaningful conversations online, we started coming back to the fact that many people who were advocating for this were actually royalty owners who had land that had oil and gas wells on them. And usually they're not making enormous amounts of money, but they're making enough money, for instance, to keep their farm going.
Right.
And that wouldn't be profitable otherwise.
And I even
And
think some of them appeared in the documentary, if I recall. Like those were some of the most powerful things. I think there was one guy talking about like putting his kids through college or something like that. But
absolutely.
yeah,
So not only did we tap into a source of funds and started reaching out to landowners associations across the country, which even in 2011-12 were not on social media. And in fact,
right.
when we asked for a list of emails from one of them, they sent us a literal photocopied list of emails in the mail that we had to use. But that was not only a source for funding the film, which happened then very quickly once we tapped into this community, but also a source for content and interviews and talking with people who were giving us arguments we couldn't have thought of. So that was, again, smallest possible community of people who are actually interested. Bootstrap, no budget, etc. But the other side of this is for those who are going to spend money on content creation, especially you were talking about thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to make a video, it is a reality of the situation that you must advertise. Or at least in my mind, why the if I build it, they will come method is going to lose you money more than it's going to make you money or make you or give or provide value, in the sense that there is so much competition now for eyeballs. And this is something that is not controversial except at nonprofits or except at liberty organizations that I've talked to, because it turns out when you make a $250 million Avengers movie, you spend another $200 million advertising that Avengers movie.
Right.
Well,
Which that's a really great example because why do that? You know everybody's going to talk about it. It's going to get a ton of free press. So the fact that they do that for something like that, which is just automatically in the cultural zeitgeist, I mean, that illustrates to me the scale of the problem of the competition for eyeballs.
yes, absolutely. And they do it because of that competition, because because there's Justice League and because there's Batman and because there's whatever who are also wanting these people's attention. And I forget the exact statistic, but sometimes it takes upwards of 100, 200 times for something to be visible to someone before it will stick in their brain or before they will even consider buying the ticket or reading the book or whatever it is. Now, look, liberty organizations typically aren't that flush with cash. So I'm not saying if you spend $20,000 on a video, you need to spend $20,000 advertising it, although it would probably net you much better results. But if you're going to spend $20,000 on it, think about spending at least a couple hundred, $500, $1,000. Typically, the organization I work for tries to do at least a 20% advertising budget of whatever the production is, and sometimes 25 or 30% depending on what we think will be the impactful nature of the content. But in advertising, that is what gets you a ton of information about audiences. And partially the value, I think, of advertising is that you learn so much about who is watching your content, who is consuming it to the end, who's tuning out at the beginning. Are you reaching more men than women? Are there people who are searching for certain things that are finding your content? And the very simple idea, maybe many of your people in your audience have heard about it, maybe not, but of A/B testing, of creating multiple ads for the same content and targeting the same audience and seeing which ones play out well. We'll set up 5 or 6 ads for a video at the organization I work for, and in the first couple days, we can easily see which ad is really hitting home and which is not. And then, yeah, we've lost $100 out of the $1,500 advertising budget, but now we have $1,400 to put into an incredibly effective ad.
Well, and it's worth highlighting. How often are you surprised by which one works?
A lot, actually. I mean, we have, even with the amount we've done and thinking that we understand our audiences, it can still be incredibly surprising what is effective for a particular piece of content, what people are particularly interested in about that content, what aesthetic grabs them about that content. The amount of times we make a documentary and we have these scenes where we think like, oh my goodness, this is the most beautiful, moving scene in the documentary. And then some other scene that we spent 10 minutes on in production is the one where people go, wow, that was so cool. And then they don't even talk about the really great scene that we thought was impactful and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's true across content. And in fact, the best people I know are the ones who keep a very sharp antenna out for what people are responding to. I mean, people, and including myself, one of the things that we recognized was so innovative in the content space about what Alex Epstein was doing was focusing on, I'm going to give you a framework for thinking about the issue before I give you the facts that fill in that framework.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know what I'm talking about, read The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels or just look up some of the videos he's done. But a lot of that came, like there was some of that framework in the original book, but it was only once he started talking to CEOs and seeing that they were getting excited about the framework and not about, you know, the stuff that he thought was really kind of going to catch on and be interesting to people, that he doubled down, and that became more and more emphasized until in the new version that he's working on of the book, that is front and center the whole time. And so, and I've had a similar experience myself, is that when you actually listen to the market feedback, and one of the great things about advertising and more generally just doing social media with all the metrics that we have, is that you'll get more of those discoveries if you look for them. And I mean, A/B testing is great because precisely this reason of you give yourself the possibility of discovering things that people get excited about, at least at a much more rapid rate than it's just, here's a new video, this one worked, this one didn't. And maybe it was just, I had a crappy way to, like, you know, catch people's attention. Like it was a bad headline or a bad description, or the screenshot was garbage. Like you don't know. And so looking for ways to multiply your chances of getting a hit and then learning from that, like that will escalate your learning so fast.
And if you're unfamiliar with this concept, just open Netflix at any given time, close it, wait a couple days, open it again, and a lot of the descriptions and the pictures will be different of the characters in a show. I can think about House of Cards, for instance, if anyone watched that show. Pre-scandal era with Kevin Spacey.
Right.
They would rotate who was featured based on who they thought someone's favorite character was, for instance, to see if they could get them to click on it to open it up and watch more. And then if you start doing that, you'll see patterns about the types of people that show up on your Netflix queue. It's an interesting experiment only because Netflix does it so blatantly and so often that you can actually game it a little bit if you want to try and see how you can make things appear. It's an interesting little backwards engineering of A/B testing.
Yeah, and I actually think it's a really good thing. I think what often happens is, like, liberty organizations will watch other liberty organizations. And so you have a whole bunch of people who are not at the top of the learning curve. It's a step above if you start looking at, like, left-wing organizations who tend to be much better at this. It's an even bigger step above if you can also spread out and look at completely different industries who are like the leaders in these different fields, like entertainment, and see how are they trying to attract an audience. Because I mean, entertainment is so interesting in that they have to attract purely by being interesting. Like they're almost never have practical value to offer in terms of, like, this will help you lose weight, this will help you get a girlfriend. Usually what they put out causes us to gain weight and not find a girlfriend because we're stuck in front of the TV or the video game. And so there's this intense excelling at being interesting and figuring out what your audience or potential audience finds interesting, that I think is just a treasure trove if you pay attention.
I think that's great. And just setting a standing order in your mind to think about when I click on something, when I choose to engage in a piece of content, what was it about that made me click on it? And I don't just mean from a liberty organization that you like. I mean from Netflix, Hulu, Apple, Amazon, why this product over another product? What made you click on it, and do a tiny bit of introspection and see if you can come up with, oh, well, it was the picture was different from others, or the copy was really interesting compared to other products that I looked for, something like that. So think about it. Be engaged in your consumption of media, and that will help.
Yeah, I don't do that enough. Like usually I do it in retrospect. Like somebody that I respect will point out a flaw in what I'm doing, and I'll realize, oh yeah, when I'm consuming information that like I that would have turned me off, or that was a missed opportunity. But I think that's super great advice. One question I wanted to ask you more about, you mentioned the importance of finding where the conversations that you want to engage in are already taking place. And you mentioned that can be challenging. What are some of the things people can do? Because I mean, I've worked and am working with clients who are trying to solve exactly this problem, and they don't even know where to start trying to find those conversations, particularly now, because, it used to be there'd be a message board, and that was like the big thing 8
Right.
years ago, 10 years ago. And, then it was like Facebook groups. But now it seems kind of very, uh, uh, it's a jungle out there. It's very hard to find these things. And I'm curious as to any thoughts you have on where do you start?
So this is again partially the advice of go smaller with your audience. And for the purposes of research, smaller to me means individuals. Who are individuals who are representative of the people you want to reach? In terms of law students, who are specific law students who seem like the type of law students we would want to talk to with our videos or with our content? And then you can either, through the use of social media, engage with these people, follow them, see where the conversations they're having, click on strange hashtags that might be a little bit scary sometimes because you don't understand what they mean. Try to learn their language. Or, even better, offer them some value to literally talk to them. We used to call, I guess, we used to call this focus grouping, but I'm just talking about having conversations about what would be valuable to them. Where are they having these conversations? Who are they having them with? What are they missing out on, and specifically with law students? Things like, what are you missing out on in your classroom experience or in your school experience? Or if there was something we could provide on campus that would help you, how could we do that, etc. And start to talk to as many people in your preferred audience as possible. And that can only happen when you go small. If you just want to do things like, I want to reach as many people as possible, it's going to be difficult. And also, you're not going to know how to do that because you're not going to know how to provide value for those people. So,
We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to take this in a completely different direction.
all right.
Which is, so one of the most fun periods of my life was when we worked together, there was a group of us who just had lunch, and I can't remember like laughing that hard in my adult life.
Yeah.
And I wish I could recreate the turtle joke. But the conventional wisdom, which I think is true, is that like one of the things that turns off a lot of people to objectivism is that most of the objectivists they meet, who are granted not like, the top people who understand it at the greatest depth and apply it to their life in the best way, but like are weird, mean, like a turnoff. As somebody who I think has seen both sides of it, you've seen the best and the worst, and thankfully are part of the best. What's your take on, why that is, and what you would like to see change just about the culture of the movement so that we can really encourage that kind of like encourage the best and kind of discourage the worst. And I don't mean discourage the worst people, push them away, but bring out the best in them and, attract the best in them.
Good question. So I and those lunches were fantastic. Also one of the best times of my adult life in terms of camaraderie and humor and back and forth in this very this fellowship that is rare to have. So those were great. If any of you out there can have those lunches with your friends more often than not, you should take advantage because they're too fleeting. So I would say that part of it is objectivism, and I started to do this after graduate school. You heard the change in my story about going from wanting to dissect it to wanting to promote it. Once you do get it to some level, objectivism that is, there is this, I don't want to call it an instinct or a nature, but it makes, the philosophy calls you almost to want to go out and tell people about it. Oh my goodness, I found this. My life is now profoundly better because I found it. Have you read this? Have you taught? But part of it is I don't think many people are ready at that point to do that. And that goes a little bit back to the conversation about rhetoric that we were having. So Aristotle, all good conversations start with an Aristotle reference, dissects the types of rhetoric that we engage in three very basic ways. He says we appeal to logic, we appeal to emotion, and we appeal to our own character. And he doesn't mean that these things are really all that separate. They're usually a unified group of things, at least at their best. But he goes on to say specifically that character is probably the most important element of these. And specifically by character, he says he means instilling in people the sense that you have good sense about you, that you are a good human being, and that you have goodwill toward them. And so I think what I would like to change about the objectivist culture, or maybe even the liberty movement more broadly, is instilling this sense of building your own character, your own ethos first, working on yourself first before you start offering up these values to other people. And that is, I think, not only consistent with objectivism, but goes back to this very classical view of rhetoric. I think Quintilian said rhetoric, he defined rhetoric as a good man speaking well. First and foremost, a good man, which was interesting. And even Cicero in De Oratore, I will butcher this quote, but says something like, if we bestow fluency upon those who are devoid of virtue, we will have not made orators of them, but actually have put weapons in the hands of madmen. Yeah. And so in my approach to persuasion, it's always about building your own house first, creating the foundation, and not just because that's how I think about philosophy and how philosophy should be to better your own life, but to me, you will only be persuasive if people see you as having good character, goodwill, a good moral foundation. It's being a genuinely good person.
I mean, I think there's no question about it because, I mean, look, when if you're trying to just sell politics, I think this is still true. But if you're trying to sell, this is how you should live your life, what you're saying in some regard is you should want to be like me. Like it's just inherent in giving advice on how to live. I mean, unless you're literally saying, I've made a mess of my life, don't be like me. But presumably that's not what people here are doing. And so if you're not an attractive person in that sense, like you're not a person of good character, and good character, not just moral character. I think it's wider than that.
Sure.
A person who's a delight to be around. There's people who have perfectly good moral characters who are, surly and like they're unattractive people in a sense. But I mean, that's why I raised those lunches we had together, because these were all moral people who were doing something great with their lives, but were just goddamn funny and like and encouraging of each other and like wanting the best for everybody around them. And that, I think that I always come back to this point of it's not ideas that sell ideas. It's ideas as embodied by and advocated by people that sell them. And that's why I think, if you think about who has turned the most people onto Ayn Rand besides Ayn Rand, certainly one of the top contenders was Rush. And they all they had was this one dedication. Now this is a little bit different example because it's not so much an issue of character, but it's an issue of they did something great in the world that people wanted to connect with and emulate and learn more about. And all they needed to see was, oh, here's one of my influences. And so I think you get, as much as my goal is to teach people communication and persuasion, I continue to emphasize the precondition is live a life worth emulating. Like that's going to be a starting point. And again, emulating isn't just living up to the virtues. It's being a great person in all of it, to the extent that's possible in every respect of your life.
Absolutely. And it's I mean, there's this element of friendship that's in it. Not that you have to be friends with every person you meet or every person you want to persuade, but elements of friendship like, I am telling you this not because I am trying to pull something over on you or I'm trying to take advantage of you. I am telling you this for your sake and because it is good for you and I want to help you. And ultimately that is, as we understand in objectivism, good for me as well, because the more good people out there, the more people who hold good ideas, generally that's better. But it's this idea of the goodwill point of what Aristotle is talking about. This concept of I have your best interest in mind. The difficulty of this, of course, and why another reason why some objectivists come off antagonistically sometimes is that sense of goodwill can very easily cross into I know better for you than you know for you.
Right.
And that's the danger of it. And building that sense of benevolence is not an easy thing to do, and it takes a lot of practice. But I think it takes a lot of what you're talking about, a lot of building yourself first, a lot of being a good person first and foremost, and really living the ideas of the philosophy in order for you to actually come off as benevolent when you're doing that.
Yeah, and I think it's genuinely so. This, one of the things I'm encouraging is like when you're communicating and persuading, the mindset is, how do I help this person? And that's why I don't like the language of like winning converts. I'm even skeptical of the language of persuasion.
Yeah.
Because one of the things for all the things I disagree with him about, admire about people like Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris is what they're amazing at is communicating that they genuinely want the best for their audience. They're not trying to win them over to a cause. They're not trying to, treat them as little pawns in their game. They're not trying to like squeeze money out of them. They genuinely want the best for their audience. And when you have that kind of genuine goodwill, that I think pays dividends, particularly if you're a person that your audience respects.
Absolutely.
All right, Daniel, this was amazing. Thank you. Hope you come back at some point.
Love to. Thanks, Don. Much appreciated.